I invite questions, paratextual or playful or truth-telling, on any or all of the papers. Perhaps I could kick off actually and ask a question for all three of you. Jean used the term the non-neutral role of the author. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between the non-neutral author and the non-neutral printer in the kinds of exchange that you were talking about.
He's an extremely complicated author. I'm not 100% sure even to have understood him. He's because he spends his time contradicting himself.
Yeah.
He in one of the letters, the books before the preface, there's a letter addressed to a certain Skadefus, who is obviously someone who's stolen the manuscript and who's published it. And of course, Lodola comes afterwards and saves the whole situation. And when you read towards the end of Baldus, you are told that Skadefus and Lodola they're on the same level. They've done that for money. So one is constantly at a loss with this Falengo. I think I still am. And to give you an answer would be, I don't think very much, wouldn't be honest and wouldn't be possible, because it's as if he's constantly, it's what Anne Mulaney notes this, he's constantly revealing himself and hiding himself at the same time. Mm-hmm. That's what his whole work is about. And he spends his time doing that, and one really gets lost not knowing really. Of course, we know it's a farce, but it's complicated. Yeah. Because I was thinking of Thomas More and the people that intervened in this kind of literary game are more numerous, but this chap is on his own, and he's just kind of extraordinary.
And what about the interrelationship with the printers?
With the printer, he was extremely. He had a close relationship with Paganini, the author, and what's interesting is that the two first editions. Obviously, he worked. The first edition wasn't as thoroughly. He didn't implicate himself as thoroughly as during the second edition of 1521, but during the 1521 edition, he was there all the time. He was in full control of everything. Mm-hmm. This is a kind of one of these control freaks. I mean, everything was controlled in that. And then what's very strange is that the two last editions, there's a posthumous edition of 1552, and there's an edition just before, which is dated circa 1535, in which there's no paratextual material, or in certain editions, and what's problematic all the more with this paratextual material is that certain of the 1521 editions comprise the Dialogus Philomusi, others don't. Mm-hmm. So it's I'm a bit at a loss too, but anyway, it was he definitely controlled. It was he was in control of what he was doing. It was not. It's only the 1520 edition that obviously escaped him. But that was current practice at the time. Yeah. I can't say much more.
Sure. Do you have a comment as well, Gary or Martin, on about the relationship between the author and the printer?
Yeah, apparently with Moore, the case was much more complicated in a way because he worked with many different printers. With Utopia, it's a very fraught matter, as I mentioned in my paper. Whether he actually actively controlled or how much control he exercised, and how important was the role of Erasmus. Nevertheless, I would argue that judging from the way that he handles his later work, especially the Responsia Lutherum, which only comes up 6 years later, basically, that it was actually an active role that he played, and that he really actively devised all these fictional roles for himself, or picked up the practice from Erasmus. I mean, it might. It's probably a question that we can never decide who actually came up with with this kind of fictionalizing technique first. But if we look at the Responsio, which was produced by Richard Pinson, who was the royal printer at the time, that came out when Moore was already in the service of Henry VIII, so he was politically active. He was also took an active part in the official anti-Lutheran campaign, and that must have been a very similar context to Forlengo's, in that he really single-handedly controlled the production of this work and devised all these fictional layers. We also know that he meticulously corrected proofs for his works. We know that he sent a copy of the first edition to Erasmus to be read, which came back, and then he decided to add this whole section about the church, which forced him to bring out a second revised edition. He added all this elaborate paratextual explanation of the revision while still preserving his fictional mask. So we do know that it was really a very active authorial control that he exercised.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more, or should we?
For Erasmus too, it was very important to have a printer, a publisher in a region also where he could feel secure to get his works published, and he moves over completely to Froben in Basel, mostly from the year 1521, and we see in the same year this revolt of the Comineros is completely crushed. And when Erasmus heard about the death of Jean Le Sauvage, there's another letter in which he's saying, now for me, there's no longer any hope in the Low Countries. And in 21, he's going out to the Low Countries forever and seeking elsewhere his happiness.
Yeah, I thought, well, thank you very much for your three presentations, and we learned a lot of things, and I was struck by the resemblance between the first two of you. I mean, why would an author play the trickster? Sometimes we know that he wants to hide, but other times we're at a loss. We don't know what's the point actually. So both Moore and Forlengo.
Do you want to?
Yes,
Forlengo is a Benedictine monk, and his book is extremely subversive at the time, and it's very interesting to note that his book only was put on the index in 1596, well after his death. But the book itself is extremely subversive for the time, and it's probably his status as a priest, as a monk, sorry, that because he did leave for about 10 years because of a woman, and he left and disappeared and came back to the church. But the idea is probably religious reasons. Yet he was protected by the Gonzaga family, because the Gonzaga family invested in the book, and he was both families were very close. It's I find probably the religious explanation, but not just that.
Perhaps he liked to play the trickster.
He obviously did. I'm sure of that.
It's the same, but with Responsio ad Luterum, I'm not so sure. Well, you made me discover it actually. I never really noticed that there were so many similarities between Utopia and Responsio in the structure. Never.
That's actually the surprising bit. I think it's easier to explain why he would play all these roles in Utopia. You can explain it by appealing to generic conventions like the Romance conventions with Forlengo, or the convention of travel literature in Utopia. But with the Responsio, I mean, of course, there are obvious practical reasons why he would want to hide his authorship in order not to appear too close to Henry VIII, in order to give the book a European dimension, as if there was this kind of fictional European community of the learned who were all actively responding to Luther and so forth. But what strikes me with Moore, especially if you compare him with other controversialists at the time, also John Rastell writes a dialogue about purgatory, where he uses a fictional scenario, But with Moore, there's always this surplus of play, if you like. It's never just strategic reasons that seem to be behind, even though they play a certain role. And underneath these fictional layers, we can also discover conventional paratextual functions like advertising the text, advertising its method, apologizing for its abusive language, and so forth. But as I say, there's always this surplus of fictional play that distinguishes Moore's text, I think.
Yes, well, thanks again for all the papers. I have a question about the relationship between control, so paratextual control, and then reading practices. Because Gabby, you made this very interesting point about the kind of reading involved in the anti-Luther responsio. You have you know, it's oneself reading as opposed to more communal, perhaps, reading practices. Mm-hmm. So could you please tell us more about that?
Yeah, what I was alluding to is a thesis that especially James Simpson has stressed recently, that in the anti-Lutheran and anti-Tyndall polemics, Moore always makes this point when he comments on exegesis, on the practice of exegesis, that reading the Bible has to be a practice that is actually communal, that language and meaning is never something that's kind of clear and uniform, that it always has several dimensions, and that only a community of readers can actually kind of do justice to a text, especially a sacred text. And that's something that we can see behind all of Moore's anti-Lutheran polemics, and I think it's kind of reflected in his paratexts in the way that he always constructs this imaginary community of readers. But of course there's also a certain anxiety in a way about misreading that we can detect, and it's, I think, an ambivalence that can never be quite solved in Moore's work. There's always this kind of ambivalence, anxiety there.
Maybe this is also, sorry, a question for Gabrielle, because we're sort of on that strain of thought right now, and maybe this is reading too much into it. But do you get the impression, given, as you say, the similarities of textual, paratextual conventions between the Responsio and Utopia and various other humanist texts, do you get the impression that this might suggest that Moore, at this point, saw himself as continuing in a humanist vein, that he had gotten this sort of assignment to engage in this polemical religious question, but he hadn't really thought, oh, okay, this is the route I'm going down now. That comes later in 1529 and with the further request that he engaged in these sorts of things. Do you think he thought he was going to continue writing humanist tracts, given the connection that it has to those conventions, or is that reading way too much into this situation?
I would see it as evidence that there is actually not that much of a break between, or of an opposition between humanist writing on the one hand and then polemical writing. It's often very much the same authors that are involved in these controversies, and I think it's very much the same techniques of writing and also the same argumentational patterns that are continued. If you think of the way that humanists thought about language, those are patterns that really can be traced in Reformation discourse as well, and Brian Cummings has admirably done this in his work. But it's also, I think, the early anti-Lutheran campaign in England was also very much conceived as a humanist enterprise, and that's what I tried to show from the title pages as well. I think Pinson, the printer, really tried to sell this off as a humanist initiative and trying to marginalize Luther as non-humanist and as unlearned in a way. And so I think, yes, Moore actively wanted to display this text as a humanist enterprise by using these same methods, perhaps. And that's why on the one hand, he's trying to mask his authorship. On the other hand, he's kind of actively revealing it through these hints and similarities.
No more questions.
Do we know the identity of the annotator in the edition that you showed us?
The last one, that's Johann Eck, who also wrote a response himself, as well as Thomas Murner and John Cochleus. And we know actually that Eck visited Moore in person. In the same copy, he notes that he went to see Moore and that he was given a copy of the responsio. And that's why he annotates it. But apparently he seems to have believed the fiction about the pirated edition. So he doesn't seem to have known that Baravellos was also Moore. He really thought that was a pirated first print.
Well, I think it remains for us to thank our speakers once again for a thoroughly entertaining as well as instructive panel. Thank you very much indeed.